Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
We've come to the last turning point and the shortest chapter of Vincent van Gogh's story, the 10 weeks that he spent near Paris at Auvers-sur-Oise. First, though, I want to give you a speedy little recap of where we've been. We began these lectures with Vincent's false starts on the way to becoming an artist, beginning with a series of failures in Holland, where he was born. He failed in school, and then in the business of his mother's family, which was art dealing. Meanwhile, he was converted to a new enthusiasm, evangelical Christianity. His father was a parish pastor, and Vincent served for a while as a lay missionary to Belgian coal miners, and in the process, he lost his faith in Christianity as a means of consolation for troubles in life and salvation after death. He exchanged that faith for another, faith in the goodness of ordinary humanity, and faith in art as a way to understand and celebrate human life, especially the lives of the poor and on the land and in the city. For 4 years, he taught himself drawing, and then he learned to paint. He then made his early masterpiece, which was intentionally crude and gloomy, a painting of farm people having a humble dinner of potatoes. He had first learned to make powerful studies, and he went to Antwerp to improve farther. His decisive turn was to move to Paris, where he saw all that he had been missing, especially 2 generations of Impressionism and its younger practitioners, which turned him away from his somber earlier style. And with a huge effort, he remade it. From those younger artists, he learned the newer methods of the pointillists, but he couldn't learn to be a Parisian artist. And after a year and a half, feeling confined and beaten down in the city, he took what he'd learned to the south of France. This was another decisive turning point. There, in the hot sun and the dazzling colors of Provence, and among the plain people that he admired, his skills as a landscape and portrait painter developed very quickly. In Arles, his radical modernity took new forms, exaggerations of color, an invention of new ways to express his own reactions of wonder and excitement to what he saw. His ambitions went even farther. He had a dream of creating a colony of younger contemporary artists in Arles, a communal studio of the South. A dream that came true when Paul Gauguin joined him briefly, but that turning point led to a dead end. The studio fell apart, and so did his mental stability. After his first terrible breakdown and several relapses, he agreed to go to a nearby asylum for mental patients at Saint-Rémy. He was allowed to paint there, and for a year he was spectacularly active through his own sheer will, despite more relapses. He left Provence for good and returned to a suburban village near Paris, which we'll talk about today. The arrangement lasted 70 days, during which he painted some of his greatest works, and after which, at the age of 37, Vincent killed himself. Auvers is 20 miles from Paris as the crow flies, and you could get there by train in about an hour from Paris. A part of its appeal for Vincent was that Cézanne and Pissarro had worked there, following the example of Charles d'Aubigny, a painter he admired very much. Collectors lived there too, including Dr. Paul Gachet, whose house is the tall one in Cézanne's picture in the lower right, also in the galleries upstairs. After a few days in Paris with his brother, Vincent moved on to Auvers, bringing some of his pictures with him, including one of his self-portraits and a letter from Théo, his brother, introducing him to Dr. Gachet. Vincent writes afterward that Dr. Gachet was crazy about the pictures Vincent had brought. He wrote his brother, I've seen Dr. Gachet, who gave me the impression of being rather eccentric, but his experience as a doctor must keep him balanced himself while he's combating the nervous ailment from which it seems to me he's certainly suffering at least as seriously as I. He directed me to an inn where they were asking 6 francs a day. I found one where I'll pay 3.5 francs a day. I really think that I'll stay friends with him and that I'll do his portrait. He tells me that I must work a great deal, boldly, and not think at all about what I've had, the euphemism for his breakdowns. He went right to work, and the next day he wrote to Theo, "Now I have a study of old thatched roofs with a field of peas in flower and some wheat, background of hills, a study I think you will like." He was smitten immediately by the town and by its irregular, surprising combinations of buildings and roads and green patches, and in general, the kind of irrepressible overgrownness of it all. The combination of rectangles with a great swarm of wriggling serpentine curves was certainly suited to Vincent's vocabulary. His new friend Gachet was not only a collector, but also an amateur painter and printmaker. One day after lunch at his house, he gave Vincent a copper plate and an etching needle and told him how to use them, as he had Cézanne years before. The result was this close-up of the doctor, with deep-set eyes and a contracted brow, freighted with thought, an expression that strikes us as troubled. It does give quite a different idea of the man than the camera did. Soon after this, Vincent painted Gachet's portrait. I want us just to look at it for a minute, at a couple of details. I'll be quiet, and then I'll be back to you. He wrote his sister when it was done. He said, "What I am most passionate about, much more than all the rest in my profession, is the portrait, the modern portrait. I seek it by way of color. I would like to do portraits which would look like apparitions to people a century from now. So I don't try to do us with photographic resemblance, but by our passionate expressions, using as a means of expression and intensification of the character our science and our modern taste for color." And he goes on, "Thus the portrait of Dr. Gachet shows you a face with the color of an overheated and sun-scorched brick, with a reddish head of hair, a white cap, in surroundings of landscape, blue backgrounds of hills. His suit is ultramarine blue, which brings out the face and makes it paler, despite the fact that it's brick-colored. The hands of an obstetrician are paler than the face. Before him, on a red garden table, yellow novels and a dark purple foxglove flower." Well, Vincent wants not to be photographic, and he certainly succeeds in that. His modern portrait will put across emotion with what he called impassioned expressions and use color to reinforce them. The blue to set off the face, the vibrations of red and green on the table to agitate the air, the strong yellow books. And he's not even mentioning the all-over unease that we feel in the wavy outlines of his shoulders and the hills behind, and the surface of curved dashes everywhere. He mentions the attributes he's given Gachet, but not what they signify. Each of the two novels is by the Goncourt brothers and deals with some distinctively modern situations. Mental illness in the case of Germinie Lassetieux, and the complexities of the art world in Paris in Manette Salomon. They signal Gachet's interests, his expertise, and his modernity. The branch of foxglove that he puts on Gachet's table is the source of digitalis, the herbal medicine for melancholia, which was Dr. Gachet's specialty. And his pose is melancholia itself. Supporting his head in this way is an attribute of melancholia, that is depression, which since antiquity was believed to result from an imbalance of the bodily humors and was a common affliction of artists. What strikes me is the intimacy of this portrait. Gachet gazes directly at the painter, who's sitting close to him. The pose, besides identifying his affliction, is extreme in its informality. It's a pose you'd give somebody you understood and even sympathized with. He wrote his sister that Dr. Gachet was a true friend, something like another brother. So much do we resemble each other physically and even mentally. Writing to Gogh, Vincent said he'd portrayed Gachet with the heartbroken expression of our time, and that it was not destined to be understood, except perhaps by Vincent himself. He goes on to write his sister, "I'm working a good deal and quickly these days. I seek to express the desperately swift passing of things in modern life." You can sense the speed in this scene on the right in Dr. Gachet's garden, and also, I think, in the vase of flowers that he painted with these quick, darting strokes. And then to Theo, he says he's finished a large canvas with some fields seen from a height, with a road and a little carriage on it, and he compares it to a picture that he'd painted 2 years earlier in Arles, a scene of harvesting. You saw part of this picture earlier. The entire landscape is a kind of crazy quilt of spring growth, intensely green in some patches, orange and green to the right, and an amazing green patch striped with lavender in the center. It all slopes down toward the river and the train tracks. The light is muted, and it's been raining. You could tell that even without the reflections on the wet road, which are those 4 stripes you see of gray-blue on the silvery surface. Here's the comparison Vincent made with his own harvest. That had been a milestone for him, a great Dutch-style panorama from an elevated viewpoint all the way to the mountains, with carefully designed perspective and the world of variety of growth and harvest activities. It's an old-fashioned picture in its summarizing scope and ambition. What's happening here to his technique is amazing, too. Look at the detail on the left to see how thick the strokes have become. On the right, in the earlier painting, look how the foreground has short, straight strokes. In the later painting, fat, serpentine marks in the uncultivated ground. And on the other side, long purple strokes for the furrows in the shadow. Between thick scribbles, between green plants. And on the left, horizontal flicks of white. For what, I don't know exactly, but it's clear that nature is reviving. Dr. Gachet had a 21-year-old daughter, Marguerite. Vincent showed her at her piano, wearing a long pink dress. I say pink because it was pink before the fading of the pigment that he used, which is probably a madder lake, which is a dyestuff and fugitive. Sadly, that's the condition of quite a lot of pictures where Vincent used that color. He paints her skirt with long, thick strokes that curve back up at the bottom, making a sort of elegant, abstract, linear pattern that soon is going to be part of Art Nouveau. She is the picture of calm, withdrawn, absorption, unlike the portrait of her troubled father. In the meantime, Vincent was out in the fields above Auvers, observing a great French subject, red poppies in bloom, painting them so that our viewpoint is down among them. The sharp contrast of complementary colors here, red and green, is a favorite device of his, as you've been seeing all along. You might have thought he was appropriating Monet with this picture. Compared to Monet, however, this is very different. Monet has milder, subtler colors, nothing like Van Gogh's strident contrasts. I think that Vincent was actually more on Daubigny's wavelength, down low in the same locale, in the midst of these fierce colors. But look at the upper left, look at how Vincent's repeated diagonal brushstrokes for the bending grasses give an urgency to the picture. The sky has his schema that you've already seen, these horizontal dashes of blue and white, vibrant and giving the effect of a slight overcast. Speaking of Daubigny, Vincent went to see the painter's widow and set up his easel in Daubigny's garden next to their villa in the center of town, and painted one of his horizontal views of the garden and house and church beyond. His way of patterning trees and shrubs is even more pronounced than it was before. Dashes of green and black that seem to whirl in circles, reminding you of the stars in his night scenes. And in the middle of this sea of pea green, he puts lavender shadows around an island of shrubs, and a kind of childlike lavender cat skulks across the grass. Flowering trees attracted him, just as they had in Provence, but he treats them differently now. Here, the leaves and the blossoms are splashed across the canvas, jittering with an energy that's in the sky, too. A pattern of hatching that doesn't represent what you would see, but what he imagined as a visual response to his own sensations. To say it again, this is Vincent's great contribution, to use the brush not just to depict the world, but also to be an instrument of expression. Earlier that year, before he left Saint-Rémy, he'd seen almond trees in bloom, and he made a similar kind of composition, minus leaves, which hadn't come out yet. He's looking through them to a flawless blue sky and patiently tracing the quirky branches. He owes a lot to Japanese design, as you've been seeing, and you can see that here. Side by side, though, you can sense the change in temperament, expressed by much greater haste in the picture at the right, impatience, perhaps, different kinds of impulses. Arles has a very distinguished little Romanesque church with a Gothic chevet closest to us. Vincent obviously liked the way that it sits on a little island of grass in the pavement that splits, and the somewhat eccentric way that its parts fit together. He exaggerated that, and I can show you with, He exaggerated that, making the eaves flare and the walls lean, painting the openings of the belfry with raised eyebrows, amping up the colors. The actual building has much less character in real life, as the display in the lower left of that photograph shows you. A display for visitors. There are lots of there are illustrated labels like this practically everywhere you go where Vincent lived and worked. Vincent certainly remembered the painting he'd made 6 years before of his father's little church in Neune in the Netherlands. He'd made a gift of this picture, the little one, to his mother when he wanted to cheer her up after she'd broken her leg. The picture is a reminder of the dour sensibility that Vincent grew up with, and a measure of just how far he'd traveled as a painter since then. Returning to Mademoiselle Gachet, he copied the picture he'd made in a letter to his brother with a suggestion that it might be hung with a landscape of the same size and shape. You can see it at the bottom. And here's that landscape. It's 20 inches high by 40 inches wide, wider than the widest canvas he'd been using. And it's something new in its panoramic effect and breathtaking, because you can't easily take it all in. You need to let your eyes move sideways across the scene. It represents the farm fields of Auvers that spread out to the north of town, above and beyond, where Vincent came often, and used other formats to paint, in this case nearly square, with pale harvested grain occupying half the picture at least, with blue sky above, and then in between the fields, in various stages of growth and harvest, you see the ceaseless cycle of life that's such an important part of Vincent's imagery for his entire career. This widescreen way of framing a landscape was just as Dutch as Van Gogh himself, and he knew that very well. It's a tradition that's best known from pictures by Jacob van Ruysdael, like the one on the left, and from many etchings and engravings, like the famous one by Rembrandt on the right, all of which have a grandeur and a sense of comprehensiveness. Vincent painted 13 horizontal pictures, which may well have had a practical purpose. Karel Zemmel has shown that he saw them as decoration in the honorable 19th century sense, what the French called décoration, meaning an ensemble of works meant to be part of the decor of houses. Horizontal compositions would mostly go over doors. Vincent was not too pure for this type of applied art. He'd written Theo that nothing would help us sell our canvases more than if they could gain general acceptance as decorations for middle-class houses. The way it used to be in Holland, he adds. 5 years earlier in Holland, he'd had a commission from a Dutch patron, here at the top left, from a Dutch patron, or hoped for patron, for 6 paintings of the seasons, which came to nothing, except for this scene of plowing and planting that he didn't get paid for. Below the Van Gogh is a picture by Daubigny, one of his role models, who used that format for sweeping views. And below that, a completely different subject at the bottom on the left, by a painter that everybody admired, Puvis de Chavannes, who had public and private commissions for this kind of allegorical frieze of figures, classical in inspiration, but modern in sentiment. And many of the Impressionists, like Pissarro on the right, were happy to oblige their clients with décoration for their houses, typically with traditional themes like these, the 4 seasons. Well, Vincent didn't find a taker for his project, but he painted the pictures anyway. And at this stage, after his debilitating attacks, you might expect disturbed paintings, reflecting some kind of inner turmoil. But the opposite seems to be true in many of these. I mean, if you can remember what he was doing exactly a year earlier, you can see what I mean. This is painted from just below his window in the asylum at Saint-Rémy. It's a radical composition in every way, surging uphill, all diagonals, no horizontals, turbulent wheat after a storm. It's an image of unease. This one of 6 months later, with the life-giving sun arising, is the order instead of stability, the image of renewal. For the most part, that's the mood of the late horizontal landscapes, which are generally subdued and reassuring views, although they're depicted with energetic brushstrokes. They picture places all around Auvers. Carol Zemmel argues that Vincent meant them as aspects of a kind of utopia, a rural dream of peace and plenty, a celebration of French country life intended for what she calls a modern Republican citizenry. That's Republican in the sense of the ideals of the Third Republic in France. The peasantry, in other words, living harmoniously with the bourgeoisie in a settled but not unspoiled place. Auvers-sur-Oise had what it took for guidebook writers and the government to promote it as an ideal place. It had all classes of people, from farm workers to wealthy suburbanites. That's, by the way, the Chateau d'Auvers, over there on the right in the picture, and a productive countryside. And Vincent wrote about it. He wrote about Auvers. It's an almost lush country, just at the moment when a new society is developing in the old, and not at all unpleasing. There is so much well-being in the air. I see it, or I think I see it, in a quiet place, like a Puvis de Chavannes. No factories, but lovely, well-kept greenery and abundance. As Vincent saw it at this time, the land seems endless, without boundaries, and endlessly changing its face in midsummer here. He paints billowing cumulus with the fattest strokes we have yet seen, making loops and knots with them in a kind of shorthand. Another picture in this series introduces a park-like planting of trees in neat rows, probably in the vicinity of the chateau. We see just the trunks, not the crowns, that must be up there, shading everything, and turning the brown trunks to lavender. The undergrowth is lush grasses and flowering plants, in the middle of which a well-dressed couple stand or walk. Vincent never was much of a figure painter, but these are a signal that here nature has been civilized and exists now for the pleasure of the Gachets and their friends. One of these landscapes is an image you know. I want to be quiet again and have a chance to look at it with you with some care. A field of heavily ripe wheat is bending in unison in the wind. On the left, a road spills into the field, red, with bright green edges. And then it turns to split the field in two. On the right, there's another road, or maybe a branch. And overhead, the sky is very dark blue, with a couple of clouds and overhead a couple of dozen crows fly around. It's a vehement picture in the clashing complementaries of blue against yellow, red against green. And perspective is reversed. We don't see the usual converging diagonals to create the illusion of deep space. But instead, the diagonals diverge from our vantage point, making the image strangely ambiguous, and I think the mood violent. Ever since Irving Stone's novelistic biography of 1934, called Lust for Life, this picture has been popularly thought of as the painter's final work. Stone used the image and invented a version of Vincent's death using it so that life would imitate art. In the book, the crows are a deadly premonition. The next day, Vincent went out into the fields and shot himself. That was actually good storytelling. And in the movie version by Vincent McNeil, 22 years later, it got even better, with Kirk Douglas playing Vincent, out painting the picture while the crows attack him. The scene was invented. The picture probably was painted a couple of weeks earlier, and the crows, which Vincent actually described as a good omen, left him alone. In 1990, Akira Kurosawa made that wonderful film called Dreams that consists of 8 reenactments of dreams that he had had, and one of them, called Crows, was of an art student who gets inside Van Gogh's paintings and travels through them and into this one. The man playing Vincent is none other than Martin Scorsese. One of these last landscapes shows the town in the rain. Everything is reduced to the simplest, bands of blue and yellows. The town seems enveloped by the fields. There's no particular activity or building, just, in fact, a single crow. Vincent is picturing a condition as much as a place. And he draws on his love affair with Japanese compositions, like the print that he owned, and his own painted version of it, and his experience at the right here of looking out from the shelter of his upstairs room in the asylum. But here, the view is from a place in the rain. It's as though the painter and the viewer were both immersed in the landscape, where they're getting pelted, being soaked, like the fields that are being restored by the rain. The last picture he painted before his death, he left unfinished. And I think it's surely the strangest. It's another kind of immersive experience. A close-up of roots clinging to a clay bank. It's tangled and hard to read, and we're too close to make sense of it right away. In last year's movie by Julian Schnabel called At Eternity's Gate, played by William Dafoe here on the lower left, Vincent is correctly shown at work on it shortly before the end. Maybe you can just see in the far background unruly school children coming towards him, ready to laugh at the painting with their teacher. And when they do, he's furious. That scene's also an invention. I might point out that the film, which is quite skillful in lots of ways, is the 14th biographical movie about Van Gogh since Lust for Life. 3 weeks earlier, Vincent had spent a day in Paris with his brother and his wife Johanna and their baby. It was a day, we just had that. It was a day full of stress, beginning with Theo's own poor health, depression, anxiety over business, and evidently there was quarreling. Friends came to visit, including Toulouse-Lautrec, you see at the top, and Albert Aurier, whom you'll hear in a minute, was the first art critic to write wholehearted praise of Vincent's work. A few days later, Vincent wrote to Theo and Jo from Auvers. I still feel very sad and continue to feel the storm that threatens you. weighing upon me too. I generally try to be fairly cheerful, but my life is also threatened at the very root, and my steps are also wavering. Despite that, he wrote to his mother and sister that he was feeling much calmer than last year, and really the restlessness in my head is greatly quieted down. He added that he'd painted several large pictures, including vast fields of wheat under troubled skies. He said he was quite absorbed in the immense plain with wheat fields against the hills, boundless as a sea. I'm in a mood of almost too much calm to paint this. He'd expected Theo and Joe to come out and visit him at Auvers, but he was disappointed to learn that they were going to Holland instead, and he must have written them an unhappy letter. And with it, he enclosed sketches of 4 new paintings. They heard not a word from him for more than a week, which was unusual. Émile Bernard, their friend, wrote 5 days later that on Sunday evening, July 27th, Vincent went into the Auvers countryside, placed his easel against a haystack, and went behind the chateau to shoot himself with a revolver. From the violence of the impact, the bullet had passed below his heart, he fell, but got up 3 times in succession to return to the inn where he lived without saying anything to anyone about his injury. Bernard didn't witness any of this, and in fact there were no eyewitnesses. I should add that Van Gogh's most recent biographers challenged Bernard's report of how Vincent was shot, but their reconstruction involving the murder by a teenager has successfully been refuted as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Gachet got a message from Van Gogh and found him in his room in the inn, where he took care of him with a local doctor who ruled out surgery. Theo was summoned, and the following day arrived in time to spend some hours with his brother. Gachet made a drawing at the bottom, and then an etching above it. Not long after Vincent died, his brother pulled together around 100 paintings and somehow managed to exhibit them in his apartment in Paris as a private memorial, partly aimed at getting critics to look at the work. As a Dutch critic wrote, Van Gogh takes things to extremes. He sometimes paints blood-red trees, grass-green skies, and saffron-yellow faces. Though I had never seen such things, I still understood him. Well, in the time we have left, I want to say something about Vincent's reputation and his influence. He is sometimes portrayed as too busy painting or too preoccupied by his inner life or too pure to care about the art market. In fact, he tried hard to sell his pictures, partly out of financial need and partly out of a utopian belief that the lives of people who looked at his pictures could be improved by the experience, and that his work could strengthen modern society. Theo sent him money and supplies regularly and took his pictures on consignment and gave him advice. But despite their efforts, neither Vincent nor Theo managed to sell any of the hundreds of pictures until the last months of Vincent's life. He exchanged some pictures with other artists, including Gogh, and evidently he swapped some for painting materials with tradesmen like particularly Julien Tanguy on the right. Vincent organized exhibitions himself, including one of Japanese woodblock prints that he'd been collecting, and he put on a show in a restaurant and dance hall of paintings by his friends, and at least 50 of his own pictures, including these 3. He showed 3 pictures in the exhibition of the Association of Independent Artists in Paris in 1888, and the following year, these 2, where one critic made note of the artist's ferocious impasto and his symphonic palette of colors. In 1890, he showed 10 pictures at the Belgian Artists' Society of Les Vins in Brussels. We have his sketch for the layout of one group, which I've used to make this image. Vincent made the only sale we know of, the Red Vineyard, the one right in the middle, to a Belgian painter for a solid 400 francs. That show in 1890 coincided with the first extensive review of his work by Albert Aurier, the man whose picture you saw a moment ago, under the title The Isolated Ones, stressing the creative madness of the artist. Here are just a few patches of a long, dense piece of prose. Beneath skies that sometimes dazzle like faceted sapphires or turquoises, that sometimes are molded of infernal, hot, noxious, blinding sulfurs, trees, twisted like giants in battle, proclaiming with the gestures of their gnarled, menacing arms and with the tragic waving of their green manes their indomitable power, the pride of their musculature, their blood-hot sap, their eternal defiance, of cypresses that expose their nightmarish, flame-like black silhouettes, mountains that arch their backs like mammoths or rhinoceri. What characterizes his work as a whole is its excess of strength, of nervousness, its violence of expression. In his categorical affirmation of the character of things, in his often daring simplification of forms, in his insolence in confronting the sun head on, in the vehement passion of his drawing and color, even to the smallest details of technique, a powerful figure is revealed. The masculine, daring, very often brutal, yet sometimes ingeniously delicate painter. Well, when Vincent read these raptures in 1890, he was embarrassed, and he felt that they misled readers, especially in attributing his talent to madness. But the review helped to open the eyes of dealers and collectors, and more important, perhaps it showed new possibilities to other artists. Of the 200-odd pictures that Théo's widow brought from Paris to Holland, many were shown in Amsterdam in 1892, and a few Dutch artists began to pick up ideas from those and test them. And one was Piet Mondrian, who seems to have responded to Van Gogh's combination of intense, pure colors, put down with a broad, detached, squarish brushstrokes. But of course, it was artists in Paris who felt the impact of Van Gogh's surprising choices of color and his energetic application of paint, probably more strongly than anybody, particularly the so-called fauve painters, including Henri Matisse and André Derain. Matisse, here on the right, had already been pulled in this direction by the pictures that Gogh had been bringing back from Tahiti, which had stylized flat forms and unnatural, or at least unfamiliar, colors. They seized Matisse's imagination, and he used those colors for French scenery, even for a park in Paris. Here's Vlaminck's portrait at the right of Derain, and Derain's portrait of Matisse, and Matisse's portrait of his wife, all using sharp complementary colors and broad simplifications that you can recognize from Van Gogh's portraits. And here is Derain on the right in the south, at Collioure, a view of olives and mountains that is unmistakably based on Van Gogh's views in Provence, but pushed even farther. The fad for Van Gogh's color and forceful style didn't last very long in Paris, but it spread to foreign artists who had been there and seen the Van Gogh pictures and the fauve paintings, the Russian, for example, Wassily Kandinsky, and his German companion, Gabriele Münter, being the most important of these. They went through their own fauve phase in the Bavarian countryside, painting agreeably distorted, colorful landscapes. And the outcome of that is well known. Kandinsky very soon let go of representation altogether, liberating line and color from the chore of depicting the world. He granted them, those elements, the autonomy that music had had for centuries. Vincent's life story, as distinct from his paintings, had also had an influence of different kind. Pablo Picasso was working in Paris at the age of 30 when his closest friend, a fellow Catalonian painter called Carles Casagemas, who fell into despair over a girlfriend and shot himself in the head. And Picasso painted this memorial to him. I think he must have seen a copy of Gachet's deathbed etching and maybe one of Vincent's self-portraits after his self-mutilation. He certainly knew Vincent's imagery, the display of the wound, the exaggerated scale of the votive candle and the flame, the light, the jarring complementary colors woven together with paint strokes applied with heavy emotional charge. Picasso saw the suicide of his desperate friend as a tragic echo of Van Gogh. The story of Vincent's poverty, mental illness, suicide was already becoming well known, alongside the growth of his reputation as a brilliant and courageous artist. Within 20 years of his death, he was seen as the prototype of the doomed outsider and the modern-day successor to the romantic heroes of the recent past, famous artists and writers who burned too bright and died young. John Keats at 25, Shelley at 29, Byron at 36. Prototypes of our Basquiat and Jim Morrison. Here are pictures memorializing the death of Theodore Géricault at the left at 32, and Thomas Chatterton, the poet, a suicide at 17. I want to say something about the two women who were responsible for the existence of two museums where the bulk of the artist's work is held. Theo van Gogh, as you heard, inherited more than 200 paintings from Vincent, paintings that were nearly worthless at the time and that passed on his death to his 29-year-old widow, Johanna. She was smart and dedicated. She returned home to Holland with everything, feeling an obligation to her husband and to Vincent, whom she liked and appreciated. She took on the job of transcribing and editing and translating much of the trove of 600 letters, knowing that they would demonstrate that despite his mental illness, Vincent was keenly self-aware and a man of high intellect. 3 volumes came out in 1914. Meanwhile, she organized an exhibition of Vincent's work. Here's the catalog in 1892 with its cover. Note the drooping sunflower with a halo over it, an emblem of an artist who was already seen as saintly and possibly as a martyr too. She lent pictures to other exhibitions, and with the cooperation of dealers, particularly Paul Cassirer in Germany, and the Dutch critic and dealer Henk Bremer, she sold some well-chosen pictures over the years, helping Van Gogh's reputation to grow in Europe. After Jo's death in 1925, her son, who was Vincent's nephew, took over the estate and managed the collection, lending it to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and finally transferring it in 1962 to a foundation that became the Rijksmuseum Vincent van Gogh, which was built next door to the Stedelijk Museum on the great expanse of park you see on the right, behind the Rijksmuseum, which opened in 1973 with 200 paintings, 400 drawings, and almost all the letters. It's been enlarged several times since. The other major figure was Helene Curler, a wealthy German who married the Dutch shipping magnate Anton Müller, and who in 1906, she had become a student of Henk Bremer on the left, there, the man who was advising Jo Bongers as well, an artist and a critic and a scholar, and the most influential figure of his time. He advised her to buy pictures by Vincent van Gogh, and she took the advice seriously. In 30 years' time, she owned 90 paintings by Van Gogh and nearly 200 drawings, as well as many other works by leading modernists. During the Depression, the Curler-Müllers donated all of this to the Dutch nation, as well as a museum building that they had begun on their 13,000-acre hunting preserve near Otterlo in central Netherlands. It's now the Hoge Veluwe National Park, where there are more museum buildings, a dreamlike hunting lodge by Berlage at the right, and a sculpture park. And spending a day there is one of the most worthwhile things you can do in the Netherlands. As Vincent's reputation grew in the 30 years after his death, eager new collectors multiplied, prices rose, demand far exceeded supply, and fakers produced more supply, new paintings and new stories to support their authenticity. Illustrated books and articles had been appearing, including a catalog in 1927 by J.B. Barthelafay of all the known works by Van Gogh. When it came to authenticity, though, there were some misjudgments and afterwards some embarrassed retractions. Since 1927, many forgeries have been exposed and new, more stringent catalogs have been written. Van Gogh fakery is a rich subject. There is a new book by Henk Tromp called A Real Van Gogh, which surveys this history and devotes a lot of attention to the experts involved and to the reason they were so often mistaken. Here's a case in point. Let's just look for a moment. We won't take a vote, but you will remember seeing another self-portrait composed in this way. The artist at work, with a painting to one side, wearing a jacket painted with a weave of blue and orange strokes. Comparing them, you see that the one here on the right, both of them, are quite a lot more convincing in the way that the brush strokes model the head and reveal the volume of the shoulder and the chest. The artist who painted the picture on the left has looked at these two, painted 2 years apart, and combined them. The picture at the top for the composition, and the head, and the one at the bottom for the lighter tone and the broken brush strokes. The result is, to put it mildly, insecure in form, superficial in technique, and generally bland. That seems clear now, but for almost 50 years, there was a great struggle over the attribution. The American collector Chester Dale bought it in 1928, unaware that the source was a Berlin dealer called Otto Wacker, who claimed that he had gotten it with many other Van Goghs from an anonymous Russian emigre in Switzerland. A dealer could show a potential customer a photograph with a handwritten expert opinion on the back, which was for many years the standard way of certifying authenticity. This one was written the year before by nobody less than Barthelafay himself. Chester Dale lent the picture to a show in New York, where the New York Times critic wrote that it was considered by many the best thing he ever did. Dale soon learned that in the meantime, Delafay had changed his mind and published the picture as a fake, together with 32 others that Otto Wacker had sold in Berlin, and that Wacker was going on trial in Berlin for fraud. He was soon convicted. Mr. Dale was not well pleased, but since it wasn't sure that all Wacker Van Gogh were fake, and since some other experts accepted his picture, Dale kept it and put it on a long-term loan to the new National Gallery of Art on the Mall in Washington with 70 other of his paintings. The picture became famous for another reason. It was on the dust jacket of the first edition, which spread the artist's popular fame far and wide. When I was a student, the picture was still hanging in the National Gallery, and Chester Dale was still president of the gallery trustees. And at that point, he had Diego Rivera paint his portrait. And the artist, Diego Rivera, showed Mr. Dale with his catalog, a collection catalog, open to that picture. By now, many experts, including Van Gogh's nephew, had told Dale that it wasn't genuine. and the staff members knew that perfectly well. But Mr. Dale is supposed to have responded with a line that's become a classic in museums. Dale said, "I know this is a controversial painting, but as long as I'm alive, it will be genuine." It wasn't removed from the galleries and put in storage until 1984. Now, this self-portrait is more audacious. It didn't come from Otto Wacker. It turned up in the late 1940s with a New York dealer who said he'd found it in France in 1946 in a garage after he'd had a flat tire. He took it to de la Faye, who went for it and wrote an article praising the picture. De la Faye wrote, "How the light throbs and glows in the head. How poignantly and honest Vincent was in giving himself over to his portrait." De la Faye said it was an unfinished study, and the halo was produced by candlelight. It was bought by a Hollywood mogul, William Getz, founder of MGM, who put it on view for friends and the press in 1949 at his home in Beverly Hills. There it is. And that is de la Faye, who was brought out to Los Angeles to explain the picture. That didn't help, because it was obvious that although it was derived from a great picture now at Harvard, it was a crude, it was crudely painted. The faker must have had the idea that there would be extra money in something special, not a run-of-the-mill pastiche, but a bright golden self-portrait, begun and abandoned, with Vincent dressing himself up in a garment embroidered with a kabuki actor from one of the Japanese woodcuts that he collected. A little jury of American experts was convened to do an investigation of the results of pigment analyses and X-rays and gave an opinion. They were against it. Back it went to Beverly Hills. Goetz sued. Life magazine ran a big story about it, and I don't know where the picture is now. Finally, just 2 years ago, a hefty book appeared with no less than 65 rediscovered drawings, and the explanation that Van Gogh had entrusted the album of drawings to friends in Arles, but then it disappeared for more than a century. This album and the book got a jubilant endorsement by one of the leading elder scholars in the field, and the author, you see here, who'd written a good deal on Van Gogh, describes and analyzes the drawings thoroughly. The announcement in Paris got lots of publicity. The new drawings present images that are almost all familiar from paintings or other drawings. Some are very surprising, like this one of the artist, seen full face, as he is in not one of the other self-portraits. And apart from being disagreeable to look at, the head is ineptly drawn with a bizarre jawline and mismatched eyes and a pouty mouth. And the background has a hectic kind of catalog of Vincent-like strokes. I think it's a mashup of elements, again, from the loosely painted self-portrait at the right and the marvelous drawing at the left, which is frontal and superbly modeled and subtly uses pen strokes that are full of variety, but disciplined and credible. This drawing is of a more familiar image of the asylum garden, looking at the tall pine trees with their flame-like clusters of foliage against the classical facade of the men's building. It's familiar from this painting, and I imagine it's copied from it, made to look as though Van Gogh had had the idea of reusing or reusing the same material in a horizontal composition. The drawings has lots of misunderstandings that are typical in drawings that are not done from nature, but instead copied from another work of art or reproduction. In other words, it's a rendering of a rendering. And what's striking in the drawing is the flatness of the foliage, the timid repetition of the pen lines, the indecipherable foreground, and the attempt to make a radiant sky using blunt strokes that destroy the illusion of space. We have a few real Van Gogh drawings of the garden that, by contrast, are full of variety, teeming with life. The one on the left was dead on arrival, like the other 64 drawings in the album. But, and here's the cheeky part, photographs and some of the original drawings of this group had been shown to the curators at the Van Gogh Museum several times before. The specialists had studied the style, the materials, the relations and known works, and told the owners more than once that the drawings are false, like the story of the history of the album. And I've heard nothing since. It may be that we have news of this and who bought it and how and why, or who went to jail. In any case, there is good news now and again on the attribution front. A few cases where curators had doubted their paintings in their collections, demoted them, put them in storage, including these two that Vincent painted in Paris while he was experimenting with different techniques for still life. Some of them, of those, for good and honest reasons, look like the work of other artists. But pigment analysis, X-rays, patient comparison above all, have restored them to Van Gogh. Other museum pictures are being shown as unsolved mysteries. The portrait on the left of Vincent in 1886 or 87, looking thoroughly soigné, may just actually be too well painted for him to have done it, and maybe by another artist. The other one in Oslo is a revolting mess, and also shows the wrong ear having been mutilated. And I dearly hope the attribution to Van Gogh will never be accepted. In these 6 lectures, we've surveyed Vincent's life work. We've retold the famous story of his losing struggle with despair and the irony of his belated popular celebrity and his influence on modern art. Now I have to finish somehow. I've wondered what might Vincent have wanted me to say. My guess is that he'd let me remind you of his motives as an artist, the desires that propelled him forward. He wrote about those in his letters from time to time. He wanted to use paintings to surprise and move his viewers by conveying his feelings in and through the act of painting and drawing. From the very beginning of his career, he drew versions of the world that were exaggerated, intensified, compared to the images that were the norm for his audience, even the Impressionist norm. He was expressing the intensity of his reactions to what he was seeing, his wonderment and delight that triggered his fearless imagination. And to what purpose? And at one point he said he wanted to create in painting a more exalting and consoling nature than what a mere glance at reality allows us to perceive. Exalting and consoling. Well, why create an exalting nature? I think he meant that the joy and the amazement that he embodies in his pictures would come through to us, would in some way pull us beyond our own limits to see in the world what we might not have seen. The dance of those olive trees, the stars bigger than life. I think that's the exalting part. And the consoling part, why do we need consoling? Perhaps like Vincent himself, we have failed ourselves or failed other people in some ways. We may be aware that we have lost love or lost youth, lost opportunity, lost feeling. He knew what he had lost. He knew what he had been denied. And he knew that he could nevertheless be stirred by what he painted to be lifted out of himself, to be consoled. I don't mean distracted, I mean comforted and reassured, consoled. I think he saw that he could console us by showing us his own full absorption in what he painted, his own identification with his subjects, and his fully committed way of rendering them. There can be consolation in the new growth on the trees right before our eyes, the trees that seem to exclude us from the joy in the blooming orchard in the distance. And there can be consolation in portraying people, like his companion in depression, Dr. Gachet, whose state of mind Vincent dared to express through what he called a modern taste in color. He dared to express the most poignant thing he ever wrote, the heartbroken expression of our time. My dear audience members, I just want to end by saying how grateful I am to you for listening to these long, dense lectures with such patient attention. Thank you. Whoa. Thank you all. Thank you.